Hey everyone, what's the crack? Today we're going to demystify the Assetto Corsa car setup. We're going to go through a super easy cheat sheet that I've actually been using for about 3 years now. I want to spend my time driving, not setting up the car. This will give you a really good base setup that you can have lots of confidence in, and if you still need to make tweaks, there are lots more detailed guides out there, but this will get you set up in minutes. This is the definitive Assetto Corsa tuning cheat sheet. So the first thing we want to do is load up your game, load up your sim, and just do laps in the car and track that you're going to attack with this setup. Don't change anything on the setup. Do laps with the base setup. The reason you want to do this is, firstly, you want to make sure your lines are right. You want to make sure you're already going as fast as possible. You also want to make sure that all your tuning changes don't actually make you slower. So do about 4 or 5 laps of really good on the edge driving and see how you get on. You need to be setting your personal best during this time. This video concentrates on hot lapping, so choose the softest compound that you have available to you. Depending on your race conditions, you may want to go for mediums or even hards. If you find that your softs are getting too hot, go for the mediums. If you find that your hards aren't getting hot enough, go for the mediums. Mediums are a good middle of the road, but do try to go for softs where possible. In Assetto Corsa, a pit stop is pretty costly, so do a full race stint with the softs just to make sure that they actually survive. If they don't survive, you may be better off going with the mediums, but for the purposes of this video, this is for hot lapping, this is for getting the best possible time. I find personally that softs, mediums or hards, the car setup doesn't actually change. So during these laps, you want to keep an eye on your gearing first and foremost. Gearing can make a massive difference to how fast you can actually go. If you're never reaching 6th gear, maybe you're not utilizing the power of the engine correctly. Now in some cases it may be desirable to never actually get into 6th gear because you want to spend less time changing gears, or it might be complicated, it might be a H pattern car or whatever, but in general the golden rule is you want to be able to use all of the revs, all of the gears available to you. So if you find that you're going up into the top of 5th gear but you're never actually hitting 6th gear, you want to shorten your final drive. The reason I concentrate on the final drive is because if you adjust the individual gears, you're actually making gears longer and shorter, and it takes them out of proportion. When you adjust just the final drive, it has an effect on all the gears across the board, but they keep that proportion of power. In some cases, you may find you want 2nd gear to be slightly longer, 3rd gear to be shorter or whatever, but do take care in those scenarios because you might actually be messing up the actual gear ratios. So I tend to stick to the final drive only. If you find that you're topping out in your top gear, you need to lengthen that final drive. Now some cars, you can't actually adjust this, so you can just skip this section. The next thing you want to do is use this super handy app called Sidekick. It's very handy for seeing your revs and speed and all that kind of stuff in general, but the handiest thing that it does is it gives you your actual tire pressures. Now, seeing your tire pressures is one thing, seeing your tire temperatures is one thing, but you need to kind of have some technical expertise to know what that means. Sidekick takes that out of it. It's like having an engineer who tells you what your pressure should be. If you go to the relative pressure screen, it'll tell you it needs to be plus 1.5, plus 2, minus 2, whatever, for each corner of the car. So that's really handy. Once you've already done a couple of laps, don't do this on your out lap, don't look at it on your out lap. Only when you're comfortable, when you're doing laps and when you're reaching your pace, only then do you want to see how bad your pressures are and how you need to adjust them. So make sure to take a quick mental note of these and adjust them in the pits accordingly. The next thing you want to adjust in the pits is the height of the car. You should be on a default fuel load right now. You want to get the car as low as possible. In general, a lower car has a lower center of gravity. Don't worry about your spring rates, all that kind of stuff. That isn't that important in Assetto Corsa to get your basic setup. Get that car low. That is important. The only thing you need to make sure of when you're lowering your car is that with your race fuel load, you're still going to pass scrutiny. So you just need to make sure that your height is greater than the actual allowed height. Other than that, it's fair game. The next one to adjust is the Aero. Now this is a difficult one because generally higher Aero means that you can go through corners a lot easier. Lower Aero means that you're faster on the straights. Now it gets kind of complicated because some cars have a front Aero and a rear Aero. The front Aero doesn't cost you top end speed. It pulls the nose in when you go through corners. Now if you don't have enough rear aero, that means that the rear can get loose because the front is glued and the rear might start letting loose. You need to find a good balance between the two. In general, the defaults on a car are pretty good and you only really need to lower or raise the rear aero. Now if you lower the rear aero too much, you might find that coming out of corners or going into corners you start losing the rear. Depends if it's front wheel drive, rear wheel drive, but in general when that rear aero is lower you're going to notice it in corners. You're also maybe going to notice it under braking, again depending on the car. The golden rule here is that you want to have that balance between front and rear aero. So sometimes if your front aero is on, let's say 4 and your rear aero is on 6, you may find that the car handles quite similarly if you put the front aero on 2 or 3 and you put the rear on 3 or 4. As long as you keep them in proportion, you'll retain the balance of the car and you might get that top end speed on the straights. So play around with that aero, find your sweet spot. General rule of thumb, if there are no straights, you don't care about having low aero. Use high aero, get through those corners. If you struggle with consistency, use high aero. If your rear aero is too high and you can't put your front aero any higher, it's going to make your car a little bit more difficult to turn into those corners because the front end really wants to turn, but the rear end wants to keep you straight. If you lower that rear aero, you'll find that the nose is a little bit more pointy, and vice versa. If you lower that front aero and you raise that rear aero, you'll find you'll probably understeer through every corner. General rule of thumb, have the front aero as high as possible, adjust the rear aero accordingly. Even if you follow those couple of rules, that will already make your car significantly faster. Now here comes the big one, adjusting your camber. This is an absolute minefield and it's very difficult to get your camber right until Camber Extravaganza. Camber Extravaganza is a super handy app that you install in Assetto Corsa, you enable it when you're in game and you get this little graphic. That little graphic will show you blue or red or green. When you're driving around the track, you'll see that it starts changing color. You'll see a little graph. Your basic goal is to, when you're cornering, make that as green as possible. So you'll often hear in racing this term called negative camber. Negative camber means that your wheels kind of bite into the track. So your wheel is like this. As you go through a corner, your wheel kind of straightens up, the contact patch of the tire becomes as big as possible. That's the only reason we have camber, is to have as much grip through the corners as possible. Camber Extravaganza shows you when that contact patch is ideal by going green. It also goes blue or red, so usually when you're going down the straights, you'll see that it's blue. Doesn't really matter. You don't need camber on the straights in general. In fact, a reduced contact patch when you're going straight is actually desirable. So when you're going through a corner and the little wheel on the graph goes red, it means that you should put more negative camber on your wheel to increase that contact patch going through the corner. On the opposite side, and usually the case in the Assetto Corsa, it's going to be blue going through the corners. Blue doesn't mean cold, it means that you have too much negative camber. Everybody sets up cars with lots of negative camber. If people are struggling corners, they tend to increase their negative camber. In general, in Assetto Corsa, you need to reduce the negative camber on most cars. Reduce it, do a few laps, and you'll see that you can get it into the green. Now, getting it into the green on corner entry, that may not be where you're struggling, maybe on corner exit, depends on how powerful the car is, but in general, if you get it green for any part of the corner, it's already a major improvement over having it blue or having it red. Believe it or not, that's the difficult part of the list already done. The next things to adjust are your brake bias. So on a four-wheel car, ideally you want every tire to be working as hard as possible. You want every brake to be braking as hard as possible. But that balance needs to be found as well. There's no point in putting it 50-50 if when you go into a corner your fronts are locking up or your rears are locking up. You basically want to be able to apply as much brake pressure without lockups. That's kind of the golden rule. Now, when you're going down a straight, barreling down at 200 or 300 kilometers an hour and you slam the brakes, the car wants to put more load on the front wheels than the back wheels. Again, it depends on how much aero you have, stuff like that. Also, if you're trail braking going around the corner, you don't want at that point to lock up. So find that sweet spot of your braking bias. In general, I kind of leave it as default unless tires are locking up. So if you find that your fronts are locking up, you need to shift that bias rearwards. If you find that the rear is locking up and maybe spinning around in a corner, you want to put that brake bias forward. So some people actually really like to put the brake bias backwards a bit, not for braking in a straight line, but when they're going through a corner, and if they can't point the car in the direction that they want quickly enough, they dab the brake to just shift the rear around slightly. Once you find that balance of a car, and if you've ever driven a car that when you're entering a corner and you're still braking and it starts rotating in the direction that you're going to exit anyway, even regardless of steering, that's a really great, really confidence inspiring way to drive a car. And if you can find that balance, you will find time. The next one is the anti-roll bar. The anti-roll bar basically controls how much your car rolls going around corners. Now you might say, well, I don't want my car to roll at all, so you just increase the anti-roll bar and it eliminates all roll. The issue with that is, as you're going over bumps and stuff like that, you may lose contact with the road. So you want that little bit of anti-roll bar so that your car can roll. Easiest way to explain what an anti-roll bar does is if you imagine going into a chicane, and imagine going in a Formula 1 car or an off-roader. An off-roader has very little anti-roll bar, it allows to sway a lot. The Formula 1 car has very little suspension travel, very little roll. So the car with less roll is very nimble, very agile. So what happens in the car with less anti-roll bar is that as you're changing direction, your momentum shift may actually break traction, may actually cause you to start spinning. So generally for tracks with chicanes, I tend to have a fairly middling anti-roll bar. I never increase the anti-roll bar much. I do decrease it though. If you've got a bumpy track or if you've got tracks that don't have chicanes and the corners are all fairly sweeping, a lower anti-roll bar tends to be pretty beneficial. So long story short, if you find that you're not struggling with changing direction, like in a chicane, if the car isn't coming loose, or if you find that in a longer corner you're not all of a sudden getting understeer, or you're not all of a sudden hitting bumps and the car is washing out wide, then don't adjust your anti-roll bar. It doesn't really matter that much, but it can find you that precious time. So the next one is your diff. Your differential in your car, in any car, ensures that the wheels spin at a similar speed, or it allows them to move independently. The lower your diff power, the more independently your wheels will turn. For instance, if you're going through a hairpin with zero diff, it means that it allows your inside wheel to almost stand still while your outer wheel rotates around it. If you have a very stiff diff there, your car is either going to start spinning up like a drift car, or it's going to cause it to just power out and go off the track. You're going to get a very wide exit. So you want to find that balance. If you're struggling for consistency, if you're struggling for corner exit, you really want to adjust your diff downwards. I find in GT cars, I just open it up. The negative about opening it up is when you're exiting a corner, one of your wheels may receive all of the power. If either of your wheels lose traction or come loose off the surface, they get all the power, which seriously slows you down. Couple that with traction control, and you're in for trouble. Your car is just basically going to go into limp mode. So you really need to find that balance, and you need to keep those wheels spinning at the same speed without compromising how nimble the car is or potentially causing you to spin out. At the end of the day, you can't use your diff to compensate for poor throttle control. You still need that good throttle control. And finally, you want to put it all together. Now, do some low fuel runs. We should still be on that 30 litres or whatever Assetto Corsa gives you by default, and you want to drop that way down. You want to get about 5 or 6 laps of fuel into that car. If you've already done laps, Assetto Corsa will tell you how many laps you're going to get out of a fuel load. Adjust that fuel load and make sure that you have enough for about 5 or 6 laps. Now go do a few laps on anger. You've confidence in your setup, you know the track quite well, and I'd be very surprised if you don't set a personal best. I'm a relatively lazy sim racer. I want really quick results and I want to race. Ultimately, we all want to race, and hopefully this cheat sheet is going to help you just race quicker, better, faster. As I said at the start of the video, this is how I do 90% of my setup work. It only takes a couple of minutes once you're used to actually doing it, and it allows you time to race. When you do your laps after all these steps have been done, I'd be very surprised if you're not a lot faster than you were before you watched this video. I'm Lawrence, thanks a million for watching. I stream every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 o'clock Irish time. Do join my Discord if you got any more questions. There is so much more out there about setup, but it's not for this video. Thanks a million everyone, I'll chat to you later.